Mary I felt it growing inside her for months. She swore it was England's heir, but when doctors opened her womb after she died, what they found made them go pale. It wasn't a baby. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what was inside Bloody Mary and why the truth was buried for centuries. November 17th, 1558. St. James's Palace became a tomb the moment Queen Mary I drew her final breath. But something unprecedented happened in the hours that followed. Her physicians didn't wait for mourning, didn't respect the usual protocols of royal death. Instead, they locked the doors to her private chambers and did something that would have been unthinkable for any other monarch. They cut open the Queen's body while it was still warm. The speed of this decision was alarming. Royal autopsies were extremely rare in Tudor England, reserved only for the most suspicious deaths or when political necessity demanded proof of cause. Yet here were the Queen's own doctors, men who had served her for years, insisting with unusual urgency that they needed to examine what was inside her. The counselors who stood guard outside the chamber could hear hushed voices, the sound of medical instruments, and then something that made their blood run cold. Complete silence. When the physicians finally emerged hours later, their faces had gone pale, drained of all color. One of them was trembling so violently he could barely hold the bloodied cloth he carried. Another looked as though he might be sick right there in the corridor. These were experienced men who had seen death countless times, who had performed dissections and treated the most gruesome injuries imaginable. Yet something about what they had just witnessed inside their queen's body had shaken them to their core. The senior physician, a man named Dr. George Owen, who had served Mary throughout her reign, was the first to speak. His voice was barely above a whisper, and those present noted that he seemed unable to meet anyone's eyes directly. He reported that they had discovered the cause of Her Majesty's suffering, but his words were carefully chosen, deliberately vague. There was corruption in the womb, he said, a growth of unnatural proportions. Something that had been slowly consuming the Queen from the inside for years. But he refused to provide specifics, refused to describe in detail what they had actually seen when they opened Mary's abdomen. The other physicians nodded in grim agreement, but none of them would elaborate further. This wasn't normal medical discretion or respect for royal dignity. This was fear, raw, unmistakable fear that whatever they had discovered inside Mary Tudor was too disturbing, too politically dangerous to discuss openly. One of the junior doctors who had assisted in the examination reportedly left London that very night, abandoning his position at court without explanation. Another fell violently ill within days and died before the month was out, taking whatever he had witnessed to his grave. The official death record would later claim sudden fever, but those close to the situation whispered darker possibilities. Had he been silenced? Had the shock of what he'd seen inside the Queen literally killed him? Or was it something even more sinister? The records from that night were buried almost immediately, sealed away in archives that would remain closed for centuries. The few documents that survived are frustratingly vague, written in coded medical language that seems designed to hide rather than reveal the truth. But one thing was absolutely clear to everyone present in those chambers. Something had been growing inside Mary Tudor. Something that she had believed with desperate, tragic certainty was England's heir. Something that had swollen her belly, caused her agony, and ultimately killed her. And whatever it was horrifying enough that trained physicians couldn't bring themselves to record the full truth. The question that haunted everyone who witnessed that night was simple and terrible. If Mary had believed she was carrying a child, if her body had mimicked all the signs of pregnancy, what exactly had been taking up residence in her womb all those months? The answer to that question was hidden behind locked doors and sworn oaths of secrecy. But to understand why Mary's body became the site of such horror, you need to go back 3 years earlier to when the Queen first announced the news that would define her final years and seal her tragic fate. April 1554. Mary Tudor stood before her assembled court and made an announcement that sent shockwaves across Europe. She was with child. At 38 years old, recently married to Philip II of Spain, the Queen declared herself pregnant with the heir England desperately needed. The reaction was explosive and immediate. Church bells rang throughout London, celebrating what everyone believed would secure the Catholic succession and prevent Mary's Protestant half-sister Elizabeth from ever taking the throne. Bonfires were lit in the streets. Citizens danced and sang, thrilled that their queen would finally produce an heir. Foreign ambassadors rushed to send word back to their governments. This changed everything. A Catholic heir meant England would remain aligned with Spain and Rome, would continue burning Protestant heretics. would cement the religious counter-reformation that Mary had fought so viciously to establish. The political implications were staggering. Philip of Spain was ecstatic. His marriage to Mary had been purely strategic, a political alliance designed to bring England under Spanish influence. But without an heir, his position was precarious. Mary was 17 years older than him, in poor health, and widely unpopular among her Protestant subjects. If she died childless, he would lose all claim to English power. But a baby? A child who would inherit both England and eventually Spain? That would create a Catholic superpower that could dominate all of Europe. Mary herself was transformed by the news. Witnesses reported that she seemed happier than anyone had ever seen her, glowing with maternal joy and religious certainty. She commissioned elaborate cradles, hired wet nurses, ordered christening gowns embroidered with gold thread. She made plans for the child's education, debated names with her ladies-in-waiting, and spent hours in her private chapel praying for a healthy son. The physical signs seemed undeniable. Her belly began to swell, growing noticeably larger week by week. She experienced morning sickness, vomiting frequently in the early months. Her breasts became tender and enlarged. She claimed to feel movement, the quickening that pregnant women described as the first fluttering kicks of life inside the womb. Court physicians examined her and confirmed what seemed obvious to everyone. The queen was indeed pregnant. Due date calculations were made. Based on when she reported feeling the first movements, the baby should arrive in late May or early June of 1555. Preparations intensified. A birthing chamber was established at Hampton Court Palace, fitted with all the necessary equipment for a royal delivery. Midwives were selected, experienced women who had delivered noble children for decades. Protocol was established for who would be present, who would announce the birth, how the news would spread throughout the kingdom and across Europe. Everything was ready. All they needed was for the baby to arrive. May 1555 came and went. No baby. The queen remained in her birthing chamber, her belly still swollen and firm, insisting that she felt movement, that the child was simply not ready yet. Sometimes babies came late. The midwives reassured her. First pregnancies especially could extend beyond the expected date. Give it time. June arrived. Still no baby. Mary's attendants began to exchange worried glances. The queen's behavior was becoming increasingly strange. She would sit for hours with her hands on her belly, talking softly to the child she believed was inside her, promising it would be born soon, that God would deliver her heir when the time was right. She refused to leave the birthing chamber, convinced that labor could begin at any moment. Outside, rumors began to spread throughout London. Something was wrong. The queen had been in confinement for over a month past her due date with no sign of imminent delivery. Foreign ambassadors sent increasingly confused dispatches back to their governments. The Spanish envoy wrote that he had seen the queen's swollen belly himself, had watched her place his hand on it to feel what she claimed was the baby moving. But no child had appeared. What was happening inside Hampton Court Palace? July came. 2 months past the expected due date. Mary's physicians were now deeply concerned, but none of them dared suggest what was becoming horrifyingly obvious. There was no baby. There had never been a baby. The humiliation of that summer would haunt Mary for the rest of her life. By August, even she could no longer deny the truth. Whatever had swollen her belly, whatever she had felt moving inside her, it wasn't a child. The pregnancy announcement had been made to every court in Europe. Celebrations had been held. Alliances had been formed based on the assumption of a Catholic heir. And now Mary had to admit it was all a mistake. The political fallout was catastrophic. Protestant enemies across Europe mocked the Catholic queen mercilessly. Pamphlets circulated claiming God had cursed her barren womb as punishment for burning heretics. Some whispered that she had lied deliberately, faking a pregnancy to secure her position. Others suggested something darker, that Mary had been possessed by demons, that what grew in her belly was something unholy rather than a child. Philip of Spain was furious and humiliated. He had endured marriage to a woman he found physically repulsive, had played the role of devoted husband, all for the promise of an heir that would give him claim to England's throne. Now he had nothing. He left England shortly after the phantom pregnancy ended, returning to Spain and avoiding his wife for months. Mary was devastated. She had wanted a child with desperate, consuming intensity, had prayed for it, had believed with absolute certainty that God would grant her this one thing. The failure crushed something inside her. But here's what made the situation truly horrifying. Something had been inside her. Her belly had swollen to enormous proportions. She had experienced physical symptoms that even trained physicians confirmed. So if it wasn't a baby, what exactly had been growing in Mary Tudor's womb? Most people assumed that would be the end of it. A tragic case of false pregnancy caused by desperate wish fulfillment and perhaps some medical condition that mimicked pregnancy symptoms. Mary would recover, accept her fate as childless, and rule without an heir. But then something impossible happened. In 1556, barely 18 months after the humiliation of her first phantom pregnancy, Mary announced she was pregnant again. The reaction this time was very different. Instead of celebration, there was skepticism and concern. Ambassadors reported that Mary seemed almost manic in her insistence, claiming she felt the baby moving, that this time it was real, that God had finally answered her prayers. Her belly began to swell again, even larger than before. The growth was rapid and alarming. Within weeks, she looked further along than many women at full term. Court observers noted that the Queen's abdomen was grotesquely distended, stretched tight like a drum. Something was definitely inside her causing the dramatic swelling. But after what had happened before, almost no one believed it was actually a child. Philip was recalled from Spain, pressured to return to England and play the role of expectant father once more. He came reluctantly, clearly doubting his wife's claims, but unable to refuse without causing a diplomatic incident. When he saw Mary, witnesses reported that he seemed shocked by her appearance. Her belly was massive, her face gaunt and aged, her eyes fevered with desperate hope. This time the symptoms were even more extreme and disturbing. Mary experienced severe abdominal pain that left her doubled over and crying out in agony. She had difficulty walking, needed attendants to support her weight because the mass in her belly had grown so large it affected her balance. Her appetite vanished. She ate almost nothing, yet her abdomen continued to expand while the rest of her body wasted away. She looked like a woman in the final stages of starvation, except for that enormous, swollen belly that seemed completely disconnected from the rest of her deteriorating frame. The Queen became convinced she would die in childbirth. She made her will, distributed gifts to her ladies-in-waiting, wrote letters to Philip about how to rule England after she was gone. She spoke constantly about the baby, about how it would be worth her death to give England a Catholic heir. But she also seemed frightened in a way that went beyond normal fears of childbirth. She would wake screaming in the night, claiming she felt something wrong inside her, something moving in ways that didn't seem right, causing pain that no pregnancy should cause. Her ladies-in-waiting tried to comfort her, but they too were disturbed by what they observed. One of them later wrote that the Queen's belly felt hard and wrong when touched, not like a pregnant woman's soft, rounded abdomen, but like something solid and immovable had taken up residence inside her. The expected due date came and passed. Once again, Mary remained in confinement, belly still massively swollen, insisting that the baby would come soon. But this time, there was less hope and more dread. Everyone who attended her could see that something was terribly wrong. The Queen was in constant pain, her color was bad, she was clearly seriously ill. And whatever was causing her belly to swell to such grotesque proportions, it wasn't moving or behaving like any baby the experienced midwives had ever encountered. Weeks passed. Mary's condition deteriorated further. She developed a fever that wouldn't break. Her skin took on a yellowish tinge that suggested liver problems. She could barely eat, could barely stand. The mass in her abdomen seemed to be pressing on her internal organs, making it difficult for her to breathe properly. Physicians whispered among themselves, too frightened to speak their suspicions aloud. This wasn't a pregnancy. This was something catastrophically wrong inside their queen's body. But what? Tumors were known in Tudor medicine, but nothing like this. Growths didn't typically mimic pregnancy so completely, didn't cause the breast changes and morning sickness that Mary had experienced. Some of the doctors began to wonder if they were dealing with something their medical training had never prepared them for. But this wasn't the first time Mary's physicians had encountered something inexplicable about her body. Years earlier, during her first phantom pregnancy, one doctor had made an observation so disturbing that he was immediately removed from court and forbidden from ever speaking of it again. Dr. John Feckenham had been one of Mary's most trusted physicians during her first phantom pregnancy in 1555. He had examined her multiple times, had felt her swollen belly, had tried to determine what was causing the symptoms everyone assumed was pregnancy. But during one private examination, something about what he observed made him deeply uneasy. He requested a meeting with the Queen's counselors and made a statement that sent shockwaves through the inner circle. What he felt inside the Queen's abdomen didn't move like a child, he reported. It felt solid, unmovable, like a mass of some kind rather than a living baby. He recommended bringing in other physicians, perhaps even surgeons, to examine the Queen more thoroughly. The reaction was immediate and severe. Feckenham was dismissed from court that same day. He was given a generous pension to ensure his silence and sent far from London with explicit instructions never to discuss what he had observed. Other physicians who might have shared his concerns saw what happened to him and kept their suspicions to themselves. Speaking the truth about the Queen's condition was clearly more dangerous than maintaining the fiction that she was pregnant. But Feckenham wasn't the only one who suspected something terrible. Several of Mary's ladies-in-waiting had begun to notice disturbing details that didn't match normal pregnancy. The women who attended Mary most closely saw things that troubled them deeply, but that they dared not speak about openly. During her second phantom pregnancy, one lady-in-waiting noticed that the swelling in Mary's belly seemed asymmetrical, larger on one side than the other, as though something irregular was growing inside rather than a properly positioned baby. Another observed that the Queen never experienced the dropping sensation that typically occurred in the final weeks of pregnancy when the baby moved into position for birth. The enormous mass in Mary's abdomen stayed high and firm, pressing up into her rib cage and making breathing difficult, but never shifting downward as a full-term baby should. Most disturbing of all, several attendants reported feeling the mass move in ways that seemed completely wrong. Not the kicks and rolls of a baby, but slow, irregular movements as though something inside the Queen was expanding and contracting independently of her will. One woman described it as feeling like something alive but not human, a description so disturbing that she was immediately silenced and never spoke of it again. The physicians who examined Mary during the second episode were walking a dangerous line. They could see that the Queen was seriously ill, that whatever was inside her was killing her slowly. But to say so openly would be to contradict the Queen's fervent belief that she was carrying England's heir. And contradicting Mary Tudor on matters of religion or succession was effectively treason, punishable by death. So they remained silent, treating her symptoms without addressing the underlying cause. They gave her medicines for pain, tried various remedies to reduce the swelling, bled her to balance her humors according to Tudor medical theory. But nothing worked, because they were treating pregnancy complications when what Mary actually had was something far more sinister. One physician, Dr. Thomas Wendy, came closest to speaking the truth. He suggested privately to Mary's counselors that perhaps the Queen was not actually with child, that perhaps they should consider other possible causes for her symptoms. The counselors responded with fury and threats. Was he suggesting the Queen was lying? Was he questioning her judgment? Did he understand what happened to those who spoke treason against the crown? Wendy backed down immediately, but the damage was done. He was removed from his position attending the Queen shortly afterward. Yet he would later be present at Mary's autopsy, and what he saw that night would confirm his worst suspicions. As 1557 wore on, and Mary's second phantom pregnancy dragged past its expected due date once again, the Queen finally had to accept what everyone else already knew. There was no baby. Whatever was inside her, it wasn't going to be born. But unlike the first time, she couldn't simply emerge from confinement and move on, because whatever was growing inside Mary Tudor wasn't going away. It was still there, still swelling her belly, still causing her agony, and it was slowly killing her. The final year of Mary's life was marked by increasing suffering and declining health. The mass inside her abdomen never receded after the second phantom pregnancy ended. If anything, it continued to grow, pressing against her organs, causing constant pain that no amount of medication could fully relieve. She could barely eat. Food seemed to aggravate whatever was inside her, causing violent cramping and nausea. Her weight dropped dramatically everywhere except her belly, which remained grotesquely swollen. She looked like a walking corpse with a massive tumor visible beneath her clothing. Foreign ambassadors who saw her during this period were shocked by her appearance. One Venetian envoy wrote that the Queen looked as though she were being consumed from the inside, her face gaunt and aged beyond her years while her belly protruded obscenely. A French diplomat reported that Mary could barely stand upright, that she moved like a woman twice her age, hunched over and supported by attendants. The Spanish ambassador wrote to Philip describing his wife's condition in terms that suggested he believed she was dying, that whatever was inside her had grown beyond any possibility of natural resolution. Mary herself seemed to understand her fate. She made a new will, arranged for Elizabeth to succeed her despite their bitter enmity, and prepared for death. But she also made one final desperate request of her physicians. When she died, she wanted them to examine her body. She wanted to know what had been inside her all this time. What had made her believe twice that she was carrying England's heir? what had caused her so much suffering. The physicians agreed, though the request made them uneasy. Autopsies were rarely performed on royalty and never without serious political justification. But Mary insisted. Perhaps some part of her knew that what they would find would be important, that the truth about her body needed to be discovered, even if it was never made public. On November 17, 1558, Mary finally died. The official cause was listed as influenza, but everyone who had attended her in her final months knew that was only partially true. The influenza had finished what the thing in her belly had started. As soon as she drew her final breath, the physicians she had designated sprang into action. They had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it, knowing that they would finally get to see what had been hidden inside their queen's body for years. The examination took place in her private chambers at St. James's Palace. Present were Dr. George Owen, who had served as Mary's personal physician, Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had tried to speak truth to power years earlier, and several junior doctors and assistants who were sworn to secrecy. They worked by candlelight, moving quickly before the body could begin to decay or before political forces could intervene to stop them. What they found when they opened Mary's abdomen would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The moment they made the first incision and peeled back the layers of skin and muscle, the smell hit them. It was wrong, profoundly wrong. Not the normal odor of a recently deceased body, but something putrid and decayed that suggested whatever was inside had been dying for a long time. When they finally exposed Mary's internal organs, every physician in that room froze. There, occupying most of her abdominal cavity, was a mass unlike anything they had ever seen in their medical careers. It was enormous, roughly the size of a full-term baby, which explained why Mary's belly had swollen so dramatically. But it was clearly not a child. The growth was irregular and lumpy, with dark, diseased tissue visible on its surface. It had attached itself to Mary's uterus and ovaries, literally consuming her reproductive organs while it grew. Tendrils from the mass had spread into surrounding tissue, wrapping around her intestines and pressing against her other organs. One of the junior doctors made a choking sound and had to step away from the table. Another whispered a prayer. Dr. Wendy, who had suspected something like this years earlier, stared at the mass with an expression of horror and vindication. He had been right. This was no pregnancy. This was a tumor, a cancerous growth that had been slowly devouring the queen from the inside. But the true horror became apparent when they tried to remove the mass for closer examination. It had grown so large and spread so extensively that it had essentially fused with Mary's internal organs. They couldn't extract it without destroying what remained of her reproductive system. The doctors worked carefully, documenting what they found, making notes that they knew would likely never see the light of day. The tumor appeared to have originated in one of Mary's ovaries, then spread to her uterus and beyond. It was dark in color, almost black in places, with areas that looked necrotic and rotted. The fact that Mary had survived for years with this thing growing inside her was remarkable. Most patients with tumors of this size and severity died much more quickly. The physicians theorized that Mary's stubborn will and desperate desire for a child had somehow kept her alive long past, when the disease should have killed her. They also noted something particularly disturbing. The tumor had caused Mary's body to produce symptoms that mimicked pregnancy. Swelling of the breasts, nausea, cessation of monthly courses. The thing growing in her belly had hijacked her body's natural processes, creating the illusion of pregnancy while actually destroying her from within. Modern medicine would later identify this as a rare effect of certain ovarian tumors that can produce pregnancy hormones, causing false pregnancy symptoms even as they kill the patient. When the examination was finally complete, the physicians faced a terrible decision. What to do with what they had discovered? The truth was devastating on multiple levels. Mary had ruled England for 5 years, believing herself to be pregnant twice, had made political and religious decisions based on the certainty that she would produce a Catholic heir. The phantom pregnancies had humiliated her before all of Europe, had damaged England's international reputation, had affected succession planning and foreign policy. And all of it had been caused by a massive cancerous tumor that had been growing inside her womb for years. If this information became public, if people learned that the Catholic Queen had been literally consumed by disease from the inside while she burned Protestant heretics and tried to drag England back to Rome, the propaganda damage would be catastrophic. Protestant enemies would claim it was divine judgment, proof that God had cursed Mary's body for her religious persecution. They would say the tumor was a physical manifestation of the evil inside her, that her barren womb had sprouted corruption instead of children. The Catholic cause in England would be irreparably damaged. So the doctors made a decision that would stand for over 4 centuries. They would bury the truth along with Mary's body. The official report would be vague and sanitized. Cause of death: influenza complicated by dropsy and other ailments. No mention of the tumor. No detailed description of what they had found. The physical evidence would be buried with the Queen, sealed away in a lead coffin where it could never be examined or questioned. But suppressing the truth came with a price. The doctors who had witnessed what was inside Mary's body couldn't simply forget what they had seen. They had looked upon something that defied the medical understanding of their time. A growth so massive and invasive that it had literally taken the place of a child in the Queen's womb. Several of them experienced psychological effects afterward. Dr. Wendy became increasingly withdrawn, reportedly suffering from nightmares about the examination. Another physician present that night, a man whose name has been lost to history, fell ill within weeks of Mary's death and died before the year was out. Some whispered it was the shock of what he had seen. Others suggested more sinister possibilities. Had he been silenced to ensure his silence? The third doctor who attended the autopsy, Dr. Owen, lived longer but was never the same. Colleagues noted that he became obsessed with studying tumors and abnormal growths, as though trying to understand what he had witnessed inside his former queen. He wrote medical treatises on the subject, but never mentioned Mary by name, never explicitly connected his research to what he had seen that night in St. James's Palace. The knowledge haunted him. Years later, shortly before his own death, Owen reportedly told a trusted colleague that he had witnessed something inside a royal patient that challenged everything he thought he knew about medicine and the human body. But he refused to provide details, taking his secrets to the grave. While the physicians who conducted Mary's autopsy were sworn to secrecy, rumors about what they had found began to leak out almost immediately. Court servants who had been present outside the room, who had heard the shocked exclamations and seen the disturbed faces of the doctors when they emerged, began to whisper. Within weeks, stories were circulating through London about what had been discovered inside the dead Queen's body. The rumors varied wildly. Some claimed the doctors had found a demon inside Mary, a physical manifestation of evil that had taken up residence in her womb. Others said it was a monstrous growth, a thing of flesh and blood but not human, not natural. Protestant pamphleteers seized on the rumors with savage enthusiasm. Broadsheets appeared claiming that God had filled Mary's barren womb with corruption as punishment for her persecution of true believers. They described the tumor in lurid, exaggerated detail, adding supernatural elements that transformed it from a medical condition into a moral judgment. One particularly vicious pamphlet claimed that when doctors opened Mary's body, they found not a baby but a mass of serpents writhing in her belly, a clear sign of demonic possession. Another described the tumor as having a face, twisted and evil, staring up at the horrified physicians. These stories were propaganda, deliberate distortions designed to damage Catholic credibility. But they spread rapidly because they contained a kernel of truth. Something terrible had been inside Mary. Something that explained her phantom pregnancies, her suffering, her failure to produce an heir. The Catholic response to these rumors was swift, but largely ineffective. They tried to suppress the pamphlets, arrested several printers, and issued their own propaganda claiming Mary had died a holy death, that her body had shown no signs of corruption or divine judgment. But the Catholic version of events was undermined by their own vagueness. They couldn't provide details about what the autopsy had actually found, because the truth was almost as damaging as the Protestant lies. A massive tumor that had mimicked pregnancy, that had caused the Queen to believe twice that she was carrying England's heir? That would still be seen as a curse, still used as evidence that God had judged Mary's reign and found it wanting. So the Catholic authorities settled for a strategy of silence and misdirection. They buried Mary quickly with minimal ceremony compared to other monarchs. They sealed the official autopsy report away where it could never be found or referenced. They intimidated anyone who tried to speak publicly about what the doctors had discovered. And most importantly, they placed Mary's body in a lead coffin and buried it in Westminster Abbey in a location that would make exhumation extremely difficult. The lead coffin was crucial. Lead was expensive, but it served multiple purposes. It preserved remains by sealing them away from air and moisture, but it also made it nearly impossible for anyone to open the coffin later without massive effort and official sanction. Whatever physical evidence existed of Mary's tumor, of the thing that had destroyed her hopes and killed her slowly, was locked away for what the Catholic authorities hoped would be forever. Modern medical historians who have studied the surviving accounts of Mary's symptoms and autopsy have reached a consensus about what killed her. She almost certainly had ovarian cancer, specifically a type of tumor called a teratoma, or possibly a large ovarian cystadenoma that had become malignant. These tumors can grow to enormous sizes, filling the entire abdominal cavity and causing all the symptoms Mary experienced. But here's where it becomes even more disturbing. Certain types of ovarian tumors can produce hormones, specifically human chorionic gonadotropin, the same hormone produced during actual pregnancy. This would explain why Mary experienced genuine pregnancy symptoms: breast enlargement, morning sickness, cessation of her monthly cycles. Her body was responding to real pregnancy hormones, just not from a baby. The tumor was essentially hijacking her reproductive system, creating a false pregnancy while slowly killing her. The phenomenon is rare but well documented in modern medicine. Women with these hormone-producing tumors can test positive on pregnancy tests, can experience all the physical changes of pregnancy, can even feel what they believe is fetal movement as the tumor grows and presses against internal organs. The tragedy of Mary's situation is that she was experiencing something her body interpreted as pregnancy while actually dying of cancer. Every symptom she had, from the swollen belly to the morning sickness to the breast changes, was real. It just wasn't caused by what she believed. The tumor likely began growing years before Mary's first phantom pregnancy, possibly during her 20s or early 30s. By the time she married Philip at age 38 and desperately wanted a child, it was already large enough to cause problems. The stress and trauma of the first phantom pregnancy, the humiliation and grief, probably accelerated the tumor's growth. The second phantom pregnancy was the tumor growing even larger, spreading into surrounding tissue, beginning to cause the severe symptoms that would eventually kill her. Mary lived approximately 3 to 4 years from when the tumor became large enough to mimic pregnancy until her death. For comparison, most patients with advanced ovarian cancer in the modern era, even with surgery and chemotherapy, have a 5-year survival rate of around 30%. Mary survived without any effective treatment beyond pain management, driven by sheer willpower and desperation to live long enough to see a Catholic heir secured. The final months of her life must have been agony beyond imagining. The tumor was pressing on her intestines, her bladder, her diaphragm. She couldn't eat properly because there was literally no room in her abdomen for food. She couldn't breathe easily because the mass pushed up against her lungs. Every movement caused pain, and through it all she maintained the fiction that she had simply been mistaken about being pregnant rather than admitting that something terrible was eating her alive from the inside. The final unanswered question that haunts historians is this: where is the complete autopsy report? The vague official document that survived lists dropsy and influenza as causes of death, but the detailed examination notes that the physicians must have created have never been found. Were they deliberately destroyed? Hidden in some archive that hasn't been discovered? Or did they never exist because the doctors were too frightened to commit the full truth to paper? Some historians believe that a complete report was written and then immediately seized by Mary's counselors or by her successor Elizabeth, who had every reason to want the truth about her half-sister's death buried. If that report still exists somewhere, it would be one of the most significant historical documents imaginable. It would provide definitive proof of what killed Mary Tudor, would explain the phantom pregnancies that shaped her final years and affected English history. Others think the report was destroyed within hours of being written, burned to ash so that no physical evidence could ever surface to damage Catholic credibility or be used as propaganda by Protestant enemies. But there's one other possibility that's even more tantalizing. Mary's body still lies in Westminster Abbey, buried in the same vault as her half-sister Elizabeth. The lead coffin that was sealed in 1558 has never been opened. Modern technology could answer every question about what was inside Mary Tudor. Ground-penetrating radar, advanced imaging, even potentially non-invasive analysis of the remains could confirm whether she had a massive tumor, could determine exactly what type of cancer killed her, could finally solve the mystery that has puzzled historians for over 4 centuries. But Westminster Abbey has consistently refused all requests to examine the tomb. The official reason is respect for the dead, preservation of historical sites. But some wonder if there's another reason. If the truth about Bloody Mary's body is still too disturbing, too politically sensitive, even after 400 years. So the secret remains buried in lead and stone beneath one of England's most sacred sites. And every time someone visits Westminster Abbey and stands before the tomb of Mary I, they're standing above the answer to one of history's most disturbing mysteries. An answer that 3 doctors witnessed by candlelight in 1558 that shocked them into silence, that some of them took to early graves. The thing that was inside Bloody Mary. The thing that she believed was England's heir? The thing that slowly consumed her from within while she desperately clung to the hope that she could secure her dynasty and prove her reign had been blessed by God. If you've made it this far, you need to subscribe to this channel right now, because we're the only place revealing the historical secrets that powerful institutions want to keep buried. Hit that subscribe button and you'll be part of uncovering truths that have been hidden for centuries. Drop a comment below telling us, should Westminster Abbey finally open Mary's tomb and let modern science examine what's really inside? Your engagement pushes this video to more people who deserve to know the real history, not the sanitized version. And smash that like button if you believe these royal secrets have been protected for too long. Every like tells YouTube to show this to more truth seekers who are ready for history without the cover-ups.